Christine is also on for today. So thank you very much for your contributions, and Costa, thanks. Over to you.
Okay, let me start before I hand over to Christine. We about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, Paul, we did a course on how to govern data.
Yeah.
And in that course, we initially allocated something like 1 hour to change and culture and ethics. And I think it was maybe 4 hours later and we were still talking about it. Because I think it's one of these areas that have just been introduced into the DMBOK. I think there's a lot, and even in our discussion around the presentation today, we keep on coming back to saying these terms like maleficence, non-maleficence, beneficence, all these interesting terms. It's how do we actually apply it to data? And so there's always been this thing of we can talk about it and we can learn about ethics and culture and stuff like that, but how do we actually get it working with data and how do we connect it? And that's what we're trying to do now. That's what Costa and Christina have prepared for. So really nice that they've spent a lot of time doing this. They're working hard. They're working with Mark, and I'm not sure if you remember, we had a data ethics from Norway. And a Norwegian bunch that are pushing the data ethics quite hard. And so from that, there were lots of questions that came about. So there's still a lot of delving into this culture and change. And I think we've got a long way to go. So please, guys, when you see something and you're not sure of the statement of how do we become data-led with data ethics and data change, let's talk about it, because I think that's what we're looking to do. Is we've put some ideas down, we've put some linkages down, but they're not, the ground is not set and it's not cast in concrete. So having these discussions will be helpful, and certainly would encourage questions, whatever they may be. So before I talk for the whole session, Paul, did you want to say something before we hand over?
No, I'm just saying, great. It's going to be interesting and looking forward to it. Thanks.
Okay. So once again, just thanks to Costa and Christine for putting in so much effort. I know we've been talking about this for the last 3 days, and it's not easy to bring it down into 20 slides. And our big focus is around that article that came out from Gartner to talk about CDOs being concerned about culture change. So we're not doing it just to follow the DMBOK. We're almost recognizing that our CDOs and our data management managers are having to deal with this culture. They can't ignore it. So let's move on. Christine, all yours.
So your microphone.
I think. Sorry, everybody. I think the operator needs to be fired.
No.
She's a change manager, not a technical person.
I'm going to switch off the camera. You know what, Christine, we always had this saying when they spoke about problems, and some people call it the ID10 problem. I refer to it as the PEPCAC problem, and it's basically the problem exists between the keyboard and the chair.
Thank you, Howard. I feel very comfortable going forward now. So,
okay,
and Costa will be presenting as well. I'm just going to switch off the video from an auditory point of view. Okay. So, okay.
Here we go.
So I'm the data culture change specialist, and Costa is the data ethics person, and we've put together a presentation based on, as Howard said, Gartner's story, but I just want to start with why is it not doing that? Okay. So our demo wheel, really what we're focusing on today is the data governance, culture change, and principle of ethics principles. And it's really moving towards establishing a culture that is data driven. And this is no small feat because it's quite complicated and multi-layered. It's about influencing mindsets that are varied and different. And as we know, people are unpredictable and they're all unique, and together they form a culture. So culture change follows a set of universal ethical principles that transcend the technology and geography of an environment. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. We decided to start off with a problem statement, and Howard alluded to this excerpt from the Harvard Business Review, which basically identifies that for the 5th consecutive year, the rating is that 92.2% of organizations are saying that culture is their largest challenge. And 4 years before, it was identified at 80.9%, which means that it has grown in 4 years by 12%. So data doesn't seem to be the problem from where I'm sitting. Culture seems to be the issue. So please ask questions as we go, but that's what we're going to try and unpack in this presentation.
So sorry, Christine. Sorry,
Sure.
Christine.
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind going back, I battled. I'm a little bit confused about that image, and I must admit, I suppose I should have asked you earlier on, is to say you can't fix culture, so just focus on the business and the rest will follow.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain that, because it's sort of saying contrary to what we are saying now, is that we need to pay attention to culture.
And Howard, of course, you would pick up that picture and the contradiction. I mean, I would expect nothing less from you. So what they're basically saying is you can't fix the culture. The culture has to, it's a process where it adapts and changes. And so if you do the right things, you actually create the right culture. So it's not really contradicting what we're saying, but it's saying it in a different way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's very great. It's very good for our data governance people that have to ensure that we're doing the right things. You're now saying that we need to do the right thing, and then the culture will follow.
Yes, it's a starting point. So don't wait to fix the culture and then, do your data. Do it from the start, and the culture will follow and adapt and become more data, centered. So, okay. Yeah, it does seem at face value like it's a contradiction, but it's not. Thank you for that, Howard. Okay. So the data-driven culture change that Howard mentioned, this was an article that we got recently. It was published last year from Gartner, and it was basically saying that CDOs need to focus on 3 key things if they are to ensure a data-driven culture. Sorry, wrong direction. And the first one is about communicating the business value of data. The next one is about the cultural change, because it is transformative and it is multifaceted. And if they're not leading that, it's not going to happen. And then the third bit is to manage the ethical implications of the data. So what we've done is we've put together a kind of a view of what we're saying when we talk about culture and ethics and the relationship they have. The general definition is culture is a result of shared values, beliefs and norms, and ethical behaviors. And that forms a culture of an organization. Now, when we talk specifically in terms of data, we are driving a whole lot of behaviors in different ways that we'll unpack a bit later. But I just want to delve a little bit further into culture. So if you look at this slide, there are multiple dimensions. Like I said, it's like a diamond with multi-facets. And you've got the green and the red ring, which describe the facets of an individual. And then you've got the yellow ring that describes the facets of the organization. And together they form this culture that we talk about. And if you can just look, just on the individual level, what makes my culture relevant are things like age, gender, sexual orientation, physical abilities, ethnicity, and race, as well as the red ring, where I live, how much income I earn, personal habits, and so we can go on. And that forms the individual, and individuals are in an organization and they make up teams. And those teams create an organizational culture, but they also have facets. And those facets are things like functional classification level, work content, division and department, security, work location, political affiliation, and management status. So when you look at an organizational culture and you start unpacking it to this level, it doesn't really, it gives you a lot of information, but specifically around data, we need to recognize that culture can eat strategy for breakfast, technology for lunch, and products for dinner, and soon thereafter everything else. This is the full comment that Peter Drucker made when he spoke about culture. And we can't change the culture. What we need to do is lead the right behaviors to change the culture. So that's what the previous slide was talking about. So really, how do we measure a culture and make it data-driven? And this made me look at not really considering a cultural dimension of organizational culture, but really what do we mean by a culture that is data driven. So leading and lagging indicators, as change managers, when we go into an organization, we very quickly pick up on the morale. So the first row are kind of measures that we do where we look at the work attendance, the performance results, the tenure of the employees, and the teamwork effectiveness. And that gives us an indication of the morale of the organization, the quality of leadership. And those are important things if we are going to drive a data culture, because it's got to start with leadership. But the lagging is turnover rates and churn. It will be employee satisfaction ratings and customer satisfaction ratings. And those are more long-term, and we're looking at more immediate, so we would focus on the first part. But where we talk about data, it gets very interesting because we're looking at leading indicators like dishonesty, disrespect, inconsistency, and lack of transparency. A nice example is people don't really want to give up their power when it comes to sharing data. If data can be shared across an organization and we break down silos, it kind of has an impact on my power domain. So you can see these behaviors, and it can already allude to where the organization or the person in this case is at with data. And the lagging indicator is really to say, where are we with regards to the continuum of trust, distrust to trust? So why I say a continuum here is there are different levels of trust. The lowest level of trust would be distrust, and the highest level, I'm going to show you on the next slide specifically what we do with the trust continuum. And then the other level is shared values, integrity, committed and competent. I'm also going to show you on a continuum how that's incorporated. So these last two rows are really looking at data culture change and what the leading and lagging indicators are. Any questions at this stage? I can't, by the way, I can't see any of the questions on the chat group.
Yeah,
So
Christine.
we do. Won't you go back? We do have some questions, right? Paul
Yeah.
Sorry. Paul Bolton, you can go first, and then Paul Grobler.
I was just jumping in for a comment made by Carl. I don't know if you've seen it, anybody, but from my perspective, this is an egg and hen question. You can't have one without the other, hence both culture eats strategy for breakfast, and you can't fix culture. There's an interdependency. So just a comment from Carl for you, Christine.
Agree.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the question?
So Paul Grobler?
Yeah, I haven't seen egg and hen. I mean, I'm used to egg, chicken and egg, but egg and hen is a different spin on it. That's nice. Christine, so I was wondering, in the leading indicators column, though, I mean, it does make a lot of sense, but it would be difficult to measure some of those, right?
Well, Paul, I've got to share a nice story with you. We were doing the How to Govern, and we were desperately asking, I think there were 4 or 5 people asking, Christine, but tell us how to measure these things. So what data do I need to collect?
Oh.
So Christine, can you please answer? I got the exact same question.
Okay, but gentlemen, I have an answer for you now because I've had time to think about it.
Right.
Okay, so so Paul, to your question, work attendance figures. Tom works for Harry, okay? Harry's a terrible boss. Tom is entitled to 6 days a month of sick leave. You can draw a report to see that Tom takes all 6 days that he's entitled to and gets doctor's notes. That's quite suspicious because Tom can't be sick for exactly 6 days every month. So the data tells a story. Performance results. If an entire team is performing badly, it reflects badly on the manager. So to say there's something not healthy about this manager, he's not supporting them or coaching them, or he's autocratic, whatever. So performance results from a team effectiveness point of view, and then individual performance results on their quarterly appraisals and that.
Yeah, those 2 are the easy ones.
Those are the easy ones.
Quite right. Yeah, quite right.
You're talking about dishonesty, disrespect.
Yes.
You're talking about the data ones.
Yeah. Those leading indicators. You've got dishonest, disrespect, inconsistent.
Now, we're going to show you a diagram to answer that question, and we would love your input on this, because we started to unpack this particular problem by saying data needs to have trust and data needs to have full agreement and consensus. Now, how do we measure that? So I'm not sure if this looks familiar, but Howard had this lovely axes where on the left you can see distrust, and really the levels from fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. And those all speak to distrust and disagreement. On the right side, so there gets a point where there's naught, where there is trust, but trust has multiple levels. And those multiple levels go from shared value, integrity, concern, competent, and accountable. So what we started to do was ask ourselves the question exactly that: how would you measure it? What would you need to see? And we basically said, for data enabled, you would need to appreciate the value of data for your first level of trust and agreement. Does that make sense?
So just to elaborate on that, Christine, you're saying that our first level of agreement, or the first step up, is what we and we've used this trust continuum and distrust continuum. That's how it's measured by psychologists, or I'm not sure who it is, but they've given us these levels of trust. So we've allocated each level, and the first level that we need to go in building our trust is creating shared values. So what we're saying there is, or what I believe you're saying is, when we get the shared values, people are starting to appreciate the value of data that they have, and therefore are moving towards or improving their data enablement. Is that's sort of what you're presenting?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, and my slides are not working with the animations. So and what we're saying is,
So you're also saying that we got also the number of levels of distrust, And so we can go from 0 to the very first stage of distrust is bringing in a fear of conflict. And we were sort of talking about that as when we have fear of conflict, people aren't going to say, oh, but your data has a problem, because that may introduce conflict. And then it will go to the next level where there's lack of commitment to say, well, all this data is bad, so I can't fix it, so I'm not committed to fix it. And then taking of the ownership and being inattentive to the results that bad data displays. And that's all about the distrust and disagreement, but we want to focus on now, how do we lift it up in terms of a positive, a trust and agreement, right?
Yeah. And so on the trust side and the different levels, what we are proposing here is the next level. If you have a look at data-led, it covers integrity and concern. So how do you know that integrity exists and it's the next level up on trust and agreement? Is related to the data quality and algorithmic nature. So you'll have a sense of, okay, we're getting to the data-led space, but it's got two parts, because we're saying data-led also has concern. And how do we measure the concern aspect? Because this is, what will happen in our what do we call that analogy, that diagram, the maturity, data maturity.
Yeah.
So what will happen, you will see a duty of care, and this is really where the custodians and stewards lead willingly and follow the data forecasting. So there's that nice word called proportionality as well. That would all be indicators that would highlight concern. So moving on from being data-led, we would look at data-driven. And this is all around being competent. So the continuum of trust and agreement, being competent. So really what will be done? And this is around credibility and legitimacy. I think for me here, it's accepted that what the data is credible, legitimate, and in place. Howard, please add if you need to. And then the last one is knowledge. I see my arrow disappeared. But it's to talk about what will you know. It's around predictive, and this is really saying it's the ability to explain and take responsibility for our decisions and choices.
Yeah, so maybe to give some background there, guys, you may have seen the slides we produced some time back where we talk about the first question that needs to be answered in our data enablement is what has happened. And we typically use things like BI, basic standard reporting, to explain what has happened. And when we get that right, we get to a point where management and people involved start to see the value of the data, and they start to see the benefit of making sure this data is clean. We go to the next question, and that's why did it happen? And we will only trust that almost the correlation to the cause if we are convinced about the fact that our data has quality. Almost that, remember, Scott talks about that we've established the truth, and not just the data, but the algorithms as well. So why comes to a level of forecasting and correlation, cause and correlation. And then we go to the next level, which will what will happen. Okay, so that's basically saying if we forecast and we prophesy using data, that's when we start to be data-led. So we can use data to predict that in 3 months' time, if you continue like this, you're either going to knock the lights out or you're going to close your doors. One of the two. So that's what that being led by data is all about. We then have to go into the data-driven, which means the data is making decisions for us. And that is the question of about what should I do? Okay, and we are not going to listen to that data. We're not going to trust the data to drive decision making if it has no credibility and legitimacy, which is typically reflected in the personal world as being competent. So if you're a competent data management professional, then we allocate a certain amount of credibility to you and legitimacy, so you can then drive the decision making, if that's helping you guys understand this. And the next level is, what don't I know? And that would be, for example, AI making decisions. And if we can't explain to people what they are missing and what they're not seeing as part of the equation, and why was the outcome like that, then we've got this challenge of not being able to explainability of the data, and then also accountability or responsibility for the decisions. So that's the progression that we take in terms of establishing trust with what we're doing, and then establishing agreement as well. So there's two dimensions that we need to look at. What is the trust in our data, and what level of agreement are we within the business? So is there general agreement? We're not asking for 100% agreement, because then we sort of just, that's groupthink. We're not talking about that, but in general, what are we in agreement with what the data is saying and the way the data is leading us and driving us to decision making? Mark, I haven't been able to read, so would you just share a little bit of your question there?
I'm not questioning, I'm commenting. The thoughts are popping into my head. I'm just feeding the beast.
Yes, so do you produce good data? And there's part of that duty of care, which we talk about, the custodians and the stewardship, and that concern that we actually presenting the data in the right way, and we've got sufficient concern that we're not going to cause any harm, and things like that. Christine, does that give a more comprehensive explanation?
Thank you so much, Howard. Technically, thank you for that. I'm wanting to ask the group, does this give them an indication of kind of how we get a sense to it, and it's a little bit more scientific and clear about the metric?
So that's almost coming back to Paul Grobler to say, Paul, this is sort of how we believe you can start to measure these areas.
Yeah, it's starting to take shape. I mean, it's still a bit esoteric, so you'll have to find practical ways in which to capture it. But I think it's in the right direction. Yeah,
I mean, and I suppose this is what we are battling with, is a situation of people can almost show that these things are recognizable, that you've achieved shared value, that you've achieved integrity, concern, and competent. The actual data measurement of it, we're needing to quantify that a little bit more, so that the data is telling you what's happening.
Yeah.
But the answer that Christine gave in the how to govern data, I liked her answer, is to say, no, we talk to each other and we come to a general agreement about how effective the leadership is. And I suppose as data people, we want to say, but I need to measure that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And we're not, not all of this is directly measurable.
Yeah, I think, Howard, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking, if I go into an organization, I don't need to really measure the tenure and the how many days the people are off, and I don't need those stats. I can already subjectively get a sense that the manager is a disaster and he's the problem, or he's a great leader, or because I assimilate that. I think this is actually a little bit clearer, because what we could say is, what is missing? We could work backwards to say, right. Is there credibility and legitimacy? Yes, no. If no, then they're probably a level 3 or lower.
Right.
So we could probably get a sense, and we could get quite clever like that. But it's a nice problem to work on and solve. So I'm looking forward to a very big data project.
Yeah, and I think Paul, what we, a part of our challenge that we had with Christine, and we were saying to Christine is, you may be measuring it like this, but somebody else may measure it slightly differently. So I know the change people have ways of trying to get that consensus, and they tend to work with that consensus in terms of the team, and that's where some of our challenges come in. Now, I think the same problem is facing us here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but we'll work on more of that. Okay, moving on. So, yeah.
So I just wanted to say it is a good frame. I don't want to disrupt too much, but can you just go back again? Sorry, Christine. Howard, I've seen, I actually heard somebody the other day talk about, the discussion was around being data driven and so on. But the person said, no, he doesn't actually think that way about his business. It's more data led. Now, I don't think it was. He saw that as something sequential, like we have here. So I sort of like. This is an interesting picture as well to indicate that there's a progression from data enabled, data led, data driven, knowledge driven.
Yeah.
I think this is useful. I don't think, like all of these kind of things, it's not all the definitions are not always clear and consistent in people's heads. So when you speak to them and they say data led, it's not that we should quickly jump and say no, okay, but that's the second step in this pyramid of mine, or this set of steps. But it does bring an interesting angle to the conversation that you have a sequence like that. That's quite interesting.
Paul, and just to add to what you're saying, and thanks for that point that you made, is if they in the position of being data led, we are saying that they have shared values, integrity, and concern. So they build on each other. So to be data led, you have to have all the previous ones. I know I didn't state that in the beginning, and I'm sure most of you know that, but sometimes what's obvious is not always obvious.
Yeah. It's a cool model.
Yeah.
So maybe, sorry, Christine, I've sort of finally been able to read Mark's question, and I like his question. Should we be adding data metrics to employee annual reviews? And this has been an interesting challenge for me, Mark. One of my customers came to me, and they're very much in a control culture. They're part of a regulation, so they're all about getting the right control. And they said to me that they wanted to put these KPIs for the employees, and then to be able to review it. And we put together a set of presentations, and they said, guys, forget it. You got one KPI. We can't have 20 KPIs, and they're broken up against the other business KPIs. So you've got one KPI to do it. And we spent a lot of time trying to find the one KPI that will drive the custodians and the stewards in the right direction. And it was quite hard to get that one KPI. But I'm sort of seeing it now, and I would start to put it down as in terms of this, the trust and agreement in the data that they are responsible for, either as a custodian, a steward, or an owner. Where do they lie on that establishment of trust? But it will come down to, well, how clearly can you measure it? And if it's subjective, then it's really hard to put a KPI as a subjective measurement. But it is a nice challenge, and it's the challenge that several of my customers are facing, to say, most of my stewards, most of my custodians are managed by all sorts of other metrics. And now you want to bring a data management KPI in, what would it be? And let's not overload them. How do you bring it down to one or two? And that was an interesting challenge.
Yeah. I mean, if we're appreciating the value of data, the only way, you know, what you measure is what you get. So you need to take it seriously. And I mean, maybe this is even an indication on the different levels, because if you're a data steward, it needs to be data led. And we've already kind of, you know, we might be able to be specific to the different levels. I'm not sure.
And the
But
biggest problem
I
we found,
agree, it needs to be on as a KPI.
the biggest problem we found, Christine, was if I choose one, for example, data quality, then we'll compromise some of the other areas. So I had to have a sufficiently rounded KPI that ensured that they didn't focus just on one element and then all the other elements got dropped. That was my problem.
So yeah, geez, that's an interesting problem. Yeah. Okay, moving on. So we then said, okay, moving from culture, data in context, where does data fit in? And we were seeing it at the center of culture change, ethics, and governance. And this is talking to the Gartner slide earlier. So here we were saying where governance and ethics overlaps, it's about action with regards to policies, procedures, and expectations. Where culture change and ethics overlap, it's about behavior, and this is personal morality, shared beliefs, norms, and values. And where governance and change overlap, it's a community of practice, as we've discussed before. And here it's very interesting because coming back to culture, within an organization might have an overarching culture of autocratic, but you might get your media department and your finance having completely different cultures. The media department being creative and the finance being rule bound. So there's subcultures within organizations, and the execution of governance is impacted as a result. So what we're saying is culture influences governance and ethics, but also governance enables ethics. So moving on, I'd like to hand over to Costa, who's going to talk specifically around the ethics. Okay.
Thanks, Christine. Hello, everybody. I'd like to start with sort of first principle. We always ask first principle is when we look at any principles in data ethics, we always ask where is the human in the data. And I'd also like to link that to some questions that were raised in the Global Data Ethics Dialogue. And these were raised about 2 weeks ago by our friends in Norway, in Dame, Norway. And the questions they raised in their presentation on data ethics and trust were, how does culture and geography impact on ethics? Does Western culture create biased foundations for developing data ethics principles? And can data ethics principles be universal? I've added a fourth question, which I believe answers their questions, and I'd like to bring in a bit of an African angle and say that Africa and South Africa can actually contribute to the emerging data ethics debate, the emerging and evolving data ethics framework and principles that are evolving. So I'd like to add Ubuntu into the mix and answer these questions, and I think Ubuntu offers some innovative insights. I'd like to start with the normative ethical theories that we all know, the consequentialist or utilitarian, the deontological, the duty, and obviously the virtue one. And I've added also the, there's one more. Chrissy, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So I've added one on contracts or rights-based as well, which I'll briefly speak to it, but I really want to show that Ubuntu can be reconciled. The African humanistic philosophy of Ubuntu can be reconciled with the tradition, the Western traditions of ethics. It completely fits in, and there are areas where it overlaps. So when it comes to duty of care and caring, community sort of based duty of care, Ubuntu is completely reconciled with that and actually honors that, the principles of Ubuntu. When it comes to goodwill, for instance, under the deontological or duty, Ubuntu is very strong on goodwill. Under utilitarianism, there are aspects of Ubuntu where you want to maximize the good for the greater community, for the group rather than the individual, and that's where Ubuntu honors that. Ubuntu really is not about egoism, so that falls away. It's not an egotistic sort of approach at all. And where Ubuntu does depart maybe from virtue, the virtue theory, I think the traditional Western approaches of ethics really focus a lot on the individual, but Ubuntu departs from that and looks more at the group or the community rather. The contracts-based one on the far right, as a motivation for ethical contract, that's more the legal sort of side. And why I bring that in is because this is a minimum moral or ethical standard. It just shows that the law can be limited. I think when we look at rules and law, it requires us, it's sort of a minimum standard of behavior. I don't think it inspires us to go further. Obviously, ethics sets a much higher standard, but this is the law sort of requires us to do the bare minimum. But it does touch obviously on things contractual. It will touch on data privacy. So privacy is a big issue that will come in over here. So moving on to our next slide. Again, some questions here. How do we link Ubuntu?
Sorry, Costa. Sorry, Costa. Yeah. Can I ask you to just go back one?
Sure.
One of the things that struck me when you were presenting is that contract / rights based is almost what we'd sort of talk about in terms of data privacy.
Yes.
And I just wanted to bring in this discussion, and I don't know whether we can provide a simple example to the people in terms of where does privacy and ethics, where do we see the difference between privacy and ethics? Because certainly GDPR tries to bring in some ethics, but it's predominantly privacy, right? Yes. So would you mind just explaining that to us in terms of what you've just pointed out here, and maybe an example of, so we as data people are going to be responsible for data ethics as well as data privacy. And lots of the times I find that I need to spend time with people explaining to them the difference. And in some cases I've been challenged, for example, in the papaya thing, is to say, you can't do any, or you can't create any harm, or you can't harm anybody. And I don't know if anybody else has got a question like that. Am I the only one in terms of trying to get a clear differentiation between privacy and ethics? So if you've got a privacy standard, which Canada's got one, California's got one, EU's got one, South Africa's getting one, how do we differentiate that? And can we say that if we deal with privacy, then we've dealt with ethics? Because, and maybe just to take it another level, I keep on saying we must deal with data risk, or the aspects of risk, and unethical behavior is similar to privacy non-compliance. So could you help me with that?
Yes, I think the breach of privacy there, I mean, Papaya speaks to it, really, if we look at our own regulations, the security and safeguards. And I think also the disproportionate, the universal principle of proportionality, or let's say the disproportionate use of people's sort of information. Let's take a patient's let's give an example here, a patient's full medical record, okay, which might have, and this comes from bioethics, let's say it has their location, their history, their activity tracking, and their social media data, for instance. Now, if you take this and you have a project that links all this, you may have some benefits. So it may say, okay, there'll be better exercise recommendations, but at the same time you have a risk of re-identification. There you have a loss of privacy. So now here the negative will outweigh the benefit of linking the sort of using the patient's full medical record. And this is where the disproportionate principle in the ethical sense is much broader than, let's say, the regulatory requirements that says, well, you know, the law might say, well, it might be a bit of an inconvenience, or if we merge two apps, let's say apps that trace a person's two different conditions, and a private company says, we want to make it private, but a charity needs it and uses it for people because they can have one app that, let's say, tracks their diabetes and their blood pressure. But the private company says, no, well, tough luck, is going to be inconvenient for them. Again, here you can see that I think the regulations might say, the laws might say it's fine, but the higher ethical standard sort of is much broader and sets perhaps much higher standard when it comes to privacy as well, or whether it's utility or privacy. I don't know if that answers your question, Howard.
Yeah, I think it does, but I just want to confirm, we are saying that, I think what you're saying is I may be able to justify my processing of the data to provide a specific business service. And
yes.
Whereas I can justify it from a data privacy point of view, I can get the lawyers to argue that it is part of my legal requirement or of operating as a business. But what you're saying is that whilst I can legally defend my privacy side of it, I can't I can't ethically defend it.
I can't ethically defend it because as in the re-identification issue, and going back to, let's say, beneficence and non-maleficence, we want to avoid harm from malicious and unexpected uses. Now, often I think most people, I give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't think data practitioners want to go out there and intentionally cause harm, but we are dealing with a new evolving field or area where there may be down the line unexpected harm that we don't immediately foresee, and I think that's the challenge. That's where it becomes difficult.
And that's what's different.
And that's why the ethical standard, the law might not anticipate those unexpected uses and that malicious harm, but ethics is a much higher standard. You have to create that awareness and keep that dialogue going, and be aware that there may be unintended consequences or unexpected harm that comes in the future. And that is the ethical challenge.
Okay, I suppose I'm not entirely clear, because you sort of saying, if I cause harm, now that would then go, for example, from a papaya point of view, you've caused harm, therefore you've violated the privacy that papaya defines.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to say is what I'm trying to ask, and maybe we should take it to the end, where there's a clear delineation between what is acceptable from a privacy point of view that's not acceptable from a ethical point of view. Okay. Let's wait till the end, and otherwise we're gonna get held up. I suppose I'm looking for a simple way, and I like Carl's thing of saying ethics is doing the right thing when no one is looking. I get that, but let's have a practical example that we can use for our CEOs and CDOs to say, here's privacy, here's ethics. Privacy means in privacy it would be okay, but ethical means it's wrong. And how would I explain in simple terms to management so that the penny will drop to say, okay, now I understand the difference?
Well, I think the bare minimum standard is to take GDPR, take papaya, okay, and it has all those 8 categories or requirements, principles. We call it conditions or limitations.
Yeah.
We have to know and be aware, because those limitations now apply in South Africa, and obviously GDPR, the data privacy principles. So that is your minimum standard, and then from that elevate it and take it higher. I mean, if you're going to follow the minimum standard, that's fine, because you will probably avoid breaches by following that. You'll eliminate breaches, possibility of fine, and damages of reputation and so on. So I guess you start with those minimum standards, but there's always the possibility of a higher standard of some harm that is caused. It may be legal, but that doesn't mean that it's ethical.
Okay. All right.
So to link Ubuntu with data ethics, we want to look at, again, thinking about the human in data. How do we apply Ubuntu in data practice to preserve human dignity, to enhance human autonomy, and to uphold the common good. And then finally, how does Ubuntu improve lives? So I just want to go through quickly a definition of Ubuntu. It is a Zulu term, which means I am a person through another person. And Ubuntu does tie in with the golden rule, because the golden rule says, treat other people as you would want to be treated, or in a data context, treat the data of others as you would have them treat your data, which means in a responsible manner with due care or concern for things like privacy, respect, goodwill, and so on. Fairness, autonomy, dignity, and reputation. So the other thing about where Ubuntu sort of takes it further than the golden rule, as we said before, it does go more into group and community interests rather than just focusing on the individual. Can we just go? Yeah. So just looking at Ubuntu, and another question here: how does Ubuntu promote shared identity or shared values, social harmony, and goodwill in data ethics? Now, Ubuntu really rests on twin pillars. The twin pillars of Ubuntu are shared identity and goodwill. By shared identity, we're looking at the shared values, that people see themselves as the members of a group. They have similar interests and goals and values. They're united by a common purpose in a joint endeavor. So in the case of data ethics, we not only share a common humanity, but I do believe most people prefer to do good than do intentional harm. On the goodwill side, this is to act. It's about acting. And we know ethics is about taking the right action. It has to be action-based. Goodwill is about acting to help others. You actively help others or acting for the sake of others. And the aim of that is to create harmonious relationships based on mutual respect and trust. So I think when we look at these principles, by and large, I do think Ubuntu does complement the traditional Western theoretical schools of ethics that we've mentioned, but it is less about the individual and it's more about acting for your community and for the group. So the group consensus, it becomes very important, and collaboration, the team dynamics becomes very important. And I think that becomes important because once you have group engagement and collaboration and consensus, it goes back to the legitimacy and the credibility of the data journey. And it is a lot stronger then, because it's inclusive, you are going to respect diversity and minority views, which I think is important as we go forward. And in this way, by honoring the human, it does bring the human back into data ethics. Ubuntu is very strong on belonging, creating a sense of belonging by broader participation, and those human connections are strong. So that is where the accountability sort of comes in. The advantage, I just want to say, the advantage of the group dynamics or group consensus. We've spoken before about the danger of leaving it to the individual, where the individual can have bias or subjectivity or blind spots. That's when you rely on the individual. When you bring the group back in, I think you're starting to work against, or is trying to eliminate individual bias by having more sort of group participation, and maybe even bringing in the more marginalized groups and mitigating that unfair bias by bringing in the minority and sort of marginalized groups. That also goes to the legitimacy and the credibility of the whole process. So this belonging and inclusivity is very much part of the DNA, and it's a very transparent sort of democratic process. It's not an adversarial them versus us mentality. The traditional, maybe Western approach has always been a little bit more competitive, more individualistic based. This is more inclusive about engagement. And I think when you get belonging right and inclusivity and engagement, it also goes to customer centricity, and I do believe it improves business performance. And I think by this way, with Ubuntu principles, by including everybody, you are enhancing human dignity and autonomy by empowering employees. So it's very much about reaching out to internal and external stakeholders. So that's the society at large, and also obviously to be customer facing, the concerns or the showing due care for your customers. can we go to the next one, please? When we look at decision...
Sorry.
Yeah.
So could I ask you a question there, Costa?
Sure.
If I can relate it back to something that Mark shared earlier on, is basically said we are all data stewards, and therefore data quality and integrity, and that is the responsibility of all of us. And that sort of ties into what you're talking about now in terms of the community or the goodwill, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
almost it's all of our responsibility to establish trust in the data.
Correct.
And getting data to a trustable, to higher levels of trust. And that's in quality, that's all the aspects, the meaning, the lack of bias, all of these things need to come together in terms of for the establishing goodwill in data.
Correct.
Okay.
It's very much saying Ubuntu is about we're all in this together. We're all in this. We've got to work together on this. And if we just go to the next slide with the CDO, let's look at the CDO. Let's look at the CDO and the CEO and the decision-making process with Ubuntu. As we said, transparent, democratic, meaning and purpose, not in the metadata sense, but meaning in your work. So we're part of, more and more global organizations are asking about meaning and purpose. What is our purpose? Why are we here? So there's greater stakeholder engagement, which is very strong in Ubuntu, and including everybody. We're all in this together. We're all working together for common goals with shared values. I just a point here about I think a lot of Western companies, a lot of corporations practice Ubuntu principles, but they don't necessarily call it Ubuntu. But I think there's a great overlap. So again, I see how it can be reconciled and it's compatible. Ubuntu certainly is not about command and control, but let's take the military that has a culture of command and control. Even in the military, in the planning stages, there will be collaboration and group participation before the plan gets executed. So there's definitely that element. Just some of the disadvantages of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not going to work. Howard, you've spoken to us a lot about chaos and about an emergency situation like 9/11 and all the pandemic. Ubuntu is about complex decisions where you have to have a lot of engagement with people. It's a complex process, so it might be a much slower process, but when you have urgency and you need to take control and you need to save lives, then obviously Ubuntu is not about that kind of situation where you have chaos of an emergency. And the other potential advantages, because of the emphasis on the group, the issue of taking ownership and accountability without competence and legitimacy. So talking to our colleagues in EIM and Norway, they made it very clear in mature organizations you have an ethics officer that champions ethics and takes ownership and drives the process. And that's very important. So that, when you get lost in the group dynamics, you do need some kind of accountability, a dedicated owner or champion to take the data ethics and run with it in ethics forums or whichever way. So, but going back to harmonious relationships that Ubuntu creates, it is because of that mutual respect and the trust and the inclusivity, you have harmony and collaboration versus conflict and discord. Go to the next one. The commonalities between Ubuntu and data governance. Data governance is about consensus, being equitable and inclusive, collaborative, and has trust and transparency. Well, the same principles apply if you apply in Ubuntu. And then finally, we want to answer the question of how do we fit Ubuntu in with these universal ethical principles, and can there be universal ethics principles? I believe there are, and as you can see, the under beneficence, where we want to sort of maximize the good. We can see there how Ubuntu, which beneficence has an aspect of being collaborative and being community-minded. That's where Ubuntu comes in and ties in with beneficence, where we want to benefit society and people and not do anything that's damaging or to their detriment, and the benefits must outweigh the risks. And also there's an aspect that we have to perhaps meet, unmet needs have to be satisfied when we're looking at rolling something out. So in community mindedness, maybe it's putting the users first. Beneficence is linked to non-maleficence in that it is to avoid harm from malicious and unexpected uses, as we said earlier. Autonomy, that's all about choice and informed consent, which is becoming so important when we look at the regulations as well, the big issue of informed consent. Justice, of course, Ubuntu is very strong on justice, on fairness, and treating everybody equally, and not making existing inequalities worse. And then I brought in two new principles. These come from bioethics and the Georgetown principles. This is explicability, which ties in with, explaining your decisions. This was brought in by the EU Commission on more on AI and trustworthiness in AI and the ethics guidelines there. That's about responsibility for the outcome and about the choices we make and the accountability. And then finally, we spoke earlier, we mentioned proportionality, where the ethical requirement is maybe broader than the regulatory requirement. It must not be disproportionate in the ethical sense. Again, here we look at risks and benefits, and we must look at the benefits must outweigh the risks. And I think that's really how Ubuntu ties up and contributes to the emerging ethics framework that we're discussing. I just want to say also that it ties in a question that you asked me a while back, Howard. Ubuntu definitely can be reconciled and compatible with not only corporate culture, but also data culture. And I think it's important from a South African and an African point of view that we are making some kind of contribution to say, yes, we have our traditional Western theories, but Africa also has a role to play in contributing to the ongoing dialogue.
Excellent. That's fantastic.
So we have just one last slide where we bring everything together, and it's taken at a review with 7 areas that Gartner mentioned. Data governance would help inform, and what we found was a lot. It complemented what we were saying, and trust they raised, so they put values and outcomes, align governance with business goals, and that's something we've said. It's accountability and decision rights. And in ours, we've taken that a step further, where we talk about decision-making process. And we've looked at accountability as being the highest form of trust. So trust is also, can you trust all your data sources? But we've taken it one step further, where we've said, what levels of trust does an organization hold? And this is identified by the questions you answer that will indicate that level of maturity. Costa spoke a lot to, ethics and transparency. Risk and security was also identified.
Privacy goes to privacy.
Yeah, around the privacy issue. Yeah. And then education and training. I mean, this is a huge transformation shift, and you can't blame them if you don't train them. So, and then I mentioned collaboration and culture as a big thing that brings it all together. I think that's all from our side, eh? Yeah.
Excellent. Guys, thank you very much. Any questions from the people on the chat on the talk? I like your thing there, Paul. Can't blame them if you can't train them. I agree with you.
Yeah, should that go into the Modelware logo?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's because from my end, I'm always looking at implementing these things, the actual implementation of them, and at the quickest time as possible. When I look at culture and ethics, it's a journey, it's a marathon, and
Yes.
yeah. I always find it difficult. How do I make a quick turnaround so that everyone can see the importance of these things? Because every time you wanted to deliver on this as in yesterday, and it's not going to be like.
If I could, it's a very good, it's a very valid, it's a very good comment, because what came up 2 weeks ago with our Norwegian friends, when they were talking about their ethics journey, they were saying, you know what, you have to take baby steps. That's the frustration. You take baby steps, we crawl, then we walk, then we start jogging, then we sprint. So it's definitely it's a process. So it's very frustrating. I can imagine how frustrating and challenging it can be when you need, the quick turnaround.
But that also goes to your very second slide there, is to say that you can't fix culture, you just have to focus on the business. So we go to, right in the beginning where we were almost saying, there we go, the next one. So we try to create a data ethics maturity and stuff like that, and then the answer is, well, you can't really fix it, so just and so how do we, then there's the whole measurement and things like that, but we do also talk about ethics by design, and we got to start introducing it and things like that.
So Howard, sorry, just to emphasize that you can't fix culture by looking at culture to try and fix it. What you need to do is focus on doing the right things, and then the culture will, will change accordingly.
It's about trying to influence the behaviors, right? I think you mentioned something like that earlier.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so what I'm just, it's a developing thought, so shoot it down if it's not going in the right direction in my mind. But I really like the Ubuntu angle to the conversation. I haven't thought about it that way before. But what's interesting from a Western culture perspective, where often values and so on, it's fine, you have something on paper, but the embodied values in most organizations in the Western world will be profit, right? And somebody said earlier, profit, can't do it all. So will there be a well, I guess there will be a natural clash between those two concepts, and I'm just wondering, in what way could Ubuntu be almost, I want to almost say institutionalized in an organization? You have to tie that back to, I guess, at the end of the day, to KPIs, or something that you can actually track that is not relating to money, right?
Yes. So, Paul, thank you. Interesting you mentioned profit. So when I really started researching Ubuntu, which is like 15 years ago, the question I posed was, can Ubuntu be reconciled with the profit motive? And I'd come to the conclusion that it can. And I'd looked at some companies that, because of employee involvement and actually involving employees in the profit sharing, and there are many examples all over the world where employees sort of share in the gains. You share the gains, and because they're involved in the decision making, and it's highly participatory. But also, I think more and more organizations are asking profit and purpose, profit versus purpose. And when you are addressing purpose, well, profit is a given. It's obviously every company works for profit. But when you add purpose to it and engagement with stakeholders and concern for your internal and external stakeholders and your customers, I think then it does honor Ubuntu principles.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as I read through the listened to the presentation, I also just realized, we always say and always try to link the data governance activities around value to the business, right? And it often just comes down to the normal what businesses pursue, but that purpose, we all know how important it is. But if I just think about some examples in my mind, if I ask like certain leaders in the community or even our customers and so on, if I ask them purpose, what the purpose is, they will not really know.
Yeah.
And we all seen that video, and I mean I love the what's the name again? What's the guy's name? Simon Sinek. About start with why, but even though we know that's important, I think we still don't get that to that point a lot.
Yeah, true.
So it's difficult to actually align. Let's put it simply: it's difficult to have a data strategy because it's difficult to actually get a clear view of what the business direction is. Often, that is.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, that's sort of what we keep saying is the data strategy needs to align to the business strategy, which needs to answer the question of the why. And sometimes we need to be able to recognize that we are not complete, and we need to go back sometimes to answering the whys and the value disciplines in that before we come back down to the data strategy. So that's always the difficult part, where we start saying, well, maybe we're not ready to do a data strategy, because I think we'll always be ready to do a data management strategy, but we may not be ready to do a data strategy.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember when you talked about the data governance, or actually the data strategy course, Howard, you said at one point, if the business strategy is not clear, just stop. Just don't continue. And although that's obviously quite a radical move, if you do data strategy in that way, if you really want to tie it back to what the business strategy is and the value chain is clear and so on, then you have to stop. I guess in a lot of ways people won't be there, so we need to maybe find a different way to approach strategy in that case. Maybe that's what you said, right? And data management strategy then, as opposed to data strategy in general.
Yeah. Okay. I want to almost leave this as a sort of challenge for us, and I'd love to hear from you guys in terms of, I'm still looking for the practical example, almost the 5-minute practical example that we can share with management that clearly explains or brings about a discussion between ethics and privacy. So, Costa, I'd love to spend time with you talking about that but what I'm sort of asking for is a practical example that they can apply to understanding this. And it's not about being more right or more effective than the other. It's almost, show me an example of what I can clearly say is, this is ethics and this is not privacy. So just to be able to explain to the newbie of the data privacy versus data ethics or to explain to our execs and our management is to how do we differentiate that. But I know it's a long discussion, and I don't think sometimes even today it's clear in terms of how would I communicate the difference to stakeholders or management that are not really aware of either one privacy or of ethics. It's about giving that, and I don't know whether you guys have seen that one cartoon that we put up on LinkedIn that, as simple as this, would explain that sort of difference between ethics and data privacy. So, I don't know if you have one now for us, Costa, or should we leave it for, let's try to have this discussion going on on LinkedIn to be able to explain the differences between the two.
Or have it as a presentation on its own. I think it will be an interesting topic.
Yeah, because when I chat to the data privacy people, they say, no, but it deals with ethics, so you don't need to worry about ethics. But when I read about ethics by design, it's not the same set of questions that I'm talking about with privacy. And I always come to that understanding of being able to say that I can legally justify ethical process or privacy processing of data, and a lot of the times it is about if I can legally justify my processing, that means I don't need to ask for consent. And I would like to challenge us to say, well, maybe we should be asking for consent, because that's more appropriate than just saying legally I'm justified, therefore it's okay. Remember that sort of discussion we had, Costa? But anyway, let's see if we can take that one a level further. If there aren't any more questions, Paul, would you like to wrap up?
Great. Thank you very much, Howard. Thanks, everybody, for the attendance. We'll publish the review tomorrow morning, and just request the link if you want to watch or go through it all again, and we'll be happy to send you the recording. Good night, everybody. Have a great evening.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.